I have tentatively titled this Ditch the Docket, which is the idea that I'm going to attempt to persuade you guys of. The subtitle is this aspect of, are we holding ourselves back? That's going to involve a whole lot of assumptions and a whole lot of ideas that are in my head that may not be in your head, okay? And that's where that kind of discussion happens, those ideas. And that's kind of where I wanted to start with some of these disclaimers, okay? These are my thoughts, my experience, and my assumptions regarding Congress. I know 100% of the Indiana coaching community does not necessarily automatically agree with some of these assumptions in my experience. I sometimes stand on my own for a couple of these things. Second of all, what I'm talking about, I'm not able to make happen. I'm not all powerful. Basically, I control a tournament that I host. And if you've been to the Chesterton tournament, you've seen that we've done some different things, including in Congress. We have this really cool round where we make up a fake scenario, have articles related to it, craft a bill last minute, and force kids to prep their speeches inside of the chamber to where they can caucus together with teammates or even kids from other schools. So there are different things that you can do in Congress with your own tournament. And what I'm suggesting here is something that we kind of pilot at tournaments, which I believe will help move Congress where we want it to be. My suggestion that I'm going to give you here today is different than what the board changed this summer. So if you haven't noticed, the IHSFA Congress docket looks very, very different. It's available on the IHSFA website. Instead of 14 pieces of legislation for the year, they've given us 5 pieces of legislation for September and October. That is radically different than what they've done before. That change happened in response to a proposal that I made that essentially encouraged them to ditch the docket. They went halfway and made a monthly change. And so we'll talk about like my idea versus what they did and kind of moving forward what I personally think. If you like these changes, we can make these changes. And I believe that if we do make these changes, it will affect the board's decision on kind of how state runs. Because with this monthly docket, I'm not totally convinced that they know exactly how they're going to do Congress at state from a bill perspective. Because they're going to have to come up with new bills every single month. And so likely they're going to do that for the state legislation. So there's still ability here to kind of influence what they do. So with this idea that we're going to try to be persuasive, I want to first do the input. Here's my assumptions, here's my data, here's my experience that I'm working with. This is going to be true for some of you guys. It's going to be different for others. But here's what we at Chesterton love about Congress. First and foremost, this event is the single most applicable event to real-world public speaking and debate of the debate events. It would be awesome to line by line destroy with disadvantages a speech like policy does. However, in the real world, you're probably not in a meeting where you're going to do that to one of your coworkers. Lincoln Douglas value discussions are great around the water cooler, but usually when you're in a meeting or an interview, you're not going to first argue for your value and value criterion. Those debates can be very robotic, very specific, whereas Congress is a type of speech that kids are going to regularly have to give to persuade. And about 3 minutes is kind of how long most of those speeches in real life end up being. We love that there's minimal entry barriers. If they're scared of Congress, they're beyond afraid of the other events. Some of our Congress kids will sit in there and never speak for the first, second, third, fourth, fifth tournament. I tell those kids that they're volunteering for detention because literally they're spending all Saturday in a classroom not talking. However, some kids want to do that. So Congress has minimal entry barriers. I love the fact that it's student controlled. If they want to debate longer, they can. If they want to debate shorter, they can. If they want more cross-ex, they can vote to do that. If they want galactic Congress, which is Congress with the lights off, I kind of consider it stupid, but technically speaking, if they pass it with the right parliamentary procedure, they can. It's also an event where we at least encourage a lot of collaboration or coalition building with students from other teams. Sometimes this happens in cross-ex, sometimes this happens to support somebody, sometimes this happens to take a competitor down or out, where you might in that moment find a good reason to work with somebody you've never worked before because you have a common goal, you're on a common side. And so while you'd normally say work with your teammates, you don't want your entire Congress squad to go aft with the same arguments. It can sometimes help to switch or shift those coalitions throughout a Congress round, which is really neat. We can all agree Congress kids getting to know other Congress kids from other schools is a unique benefit. And the other cool thing is they debate a lot of topics, and ideally timely topics. It takes a long time to make a policy debate resolution and to get ready for a debate with it, but it doesn't take that long to write a decent Congress bill, and it doesn't take that long to research and get up to speed and be able to debate it. And so those are the assumptions of what I love, and I think pretty universally coaches would say that they love about Congress as well. Now, I've been in about 15 different clinic meeting presentations about what's wrong with Congress or how we fix Congress. You know that these are some of the things that we hate about Congress. There's often little to no clash or debate. I would say that there's been a massive increase in name dropping. Sometimes, however, that's a substitute for clash, whereas kids will have a pre-written point. They will see that that pre-written point clashes with somebody else, and they will add a name drop in. That's not necessarily direct clash or the educational clash that debate would be, where you're creating arguments on the fly, but there's a lot of name dropping going on. I will say that I think clash and debate has increased recently, and the IHSFA proposal has the potential to increase that as well. We all kind of agree that there's too many canned speeches. Too many people are writing out or scripting their entire speech, and they're practicing it. It's disheartening when you've got a good debater who's not a great public speaker, and that by debating, they sacrifice some of their public speaking ability or skill because they're doing what they're supposed to in round, and they get passed over by the judge just because that person gave a perfect, pre-written, pre-planned, prepared speech. I hate that there's no willingness to amend or adapt, honestly. Bills and resolutions should be amended. They should debate amendments, and that's part of parliamentary procedure that is totally missing. However, because an amendment will eliminate people's prepared canned speeches, nobody's ever willing to do that. And so they're dead on arrival. I personally hate that Congress kids say the word contention. I've never heard an actual congressman say the word, my first contention is, I don't know why they say that. That's just me probably. And I hate about Congress, if I judge it 2 weeks in a row, hearing the exact same speech 2 weeks in a row from the same contestant, particularly when I've given them good comments and they have not adjusted their speech based upon those comments. However, like last year, plastic water bottles, there are certain bills that were used at almost every single tournament. Kids will write one speech. They will continually give that same speech instead of adapting. So, quick little discussion time, and it can happen in the chat or in person. Are there other things that we love or hate about Congress in the status quo? So things we really, really like about the event, things that we don't like about the event. Jessica, I think it's 2 things. So in the chat, she's asking about lack of amendment, a function of kids understanding. The kids have never done it, that they don't even think about it initially. However, I've never seen an amendment get the 2/3 or 3/4 necessary to pass, because everybody that's pre-written for whatever flaw is fixed will just vote no. So Matt's kind of agreeing about canned speeches. It makes it a speech event rather than debate. That's probably the #1 complaint, I think. It's disheartening when those work really well. Because the kids sound really good because they are practice speeches. Matt's asking if they know they can make amendments. Again, I would say that they probably don't. It's easy as a coach to say, okay, I like amendments. It's cool. It's educational. We probably should on this legislation. But if it's doomed to fail, if it has no chance, why set your kids up to fail? I know at nationals, one of my policy debaters who was in Congress, he tried to amend 2 different things because he thought it was fun. Doing an amendment actually leads to a new debate purely on the amendment, and then you vote on that, and then you go back to the actual legislation then. So it's a debate within a debate. Anybody willing to say that they'll defend or they actually liked the canned speech nature? That's one of those minimal barrier entry aspects. I will teach my kids to can because I think it wins. All right. Oh, I'd agree with you. I think what happens, Abby's second comment is more experienced debaters shouldn't need to give canned speeches. With my congressional debaters, I oftentimes use the word crutch. And there's a couple of examples. One example is one of Valpo's state champions in Congress. I forget her name, but she always started every single speech, no matter what, every single one, with a rap quote. Okay. And it was cool. It was interesting. But by the 4th or 5th time you heard it, it got silly. She got dependent upon that. What I find is my kids that start in Congress, they start with scripts and then they're so afraid to get away from them. Whereas if I have a kid start in Lincoln Douglas, public forum, or policy, they come in and they just debate right away. And so they don't know any better. They just do the event that they know. I feel like the Congress kids that start out on scripts, which are most of them that start as novices, they just stick there. All right. So here's what Indiana does. And then I'll get to the idea of what other tournaments that we've been to are doing. So previously, you received a docket of 14 pieces of legislation. Little, somewhat known fact, that legislation was all debated or in the national packets. So what the board does is it sifts through what was good at nationals and what had good debate, and they pick those pieces of legislation. That then becomes the docket for the year. The first 5 pieces of legislation we got were ones that were debated at nationals. Okay. There's some controversial speakers in there. There's a Russian Crimea one, but they were ones that were done. Again, I don't know about your team. It frustrates me, though, any of my kids that go to nationals and have research on this and prepared speeches on this, they pretty much don't do any new research. They just continue to give their national speeches and research in the regular season for Indiana, and they get away with that. That's old research. That was done in the spring of this year, previous season, by the time we're at state. They will write new legislation for districts and for state, although typically schools will submit the same ones for each, because if you got a good bill, you want it at both of them, plus it's less work, which means if you write your cases or you do your research for districts, you're able to transition and use that for state, and so you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Each tournament in Indiana will tell you 4 or 5 bills that you'll debate, and then you debate all of them. So as far as student choice, students get to pick the order, but since you debate all of them, it's mostly a formality. There's a few debaters out there who understand, ooh, I have a sponsorship speech here at the beginning and I know the PO, so I want this one first. Or I really want to do an affirmative sponsorship for the 3rd one, and I'm not going to do the 2nd one. And so they'll creatively organize the order to give themselves a heads up. I would say that there's only a couple of congressional debaters each year that are thinking on that level. For most people, they'll just give it in number order or tournament order, or the tournament itself will decide, taking away some student choice. Here's what most states do, which is different than what we do. There are a couple of states out there that do a year-long docket, but most states, plus nationals, plus Catholic nationals, you receive a docket of more than 10 pieces of legislation. You're usually given that a set time, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes the week of. The hosts will provide all the legislation or require teams entering Congress to supply a bill for the tournament. And so, for instance, if Concord, Valpo, LaPorte, Munster are all coming to my tournament and they all have Congress kids, they're all going to be obligated to submit a bill, okay, or multiple bills that they want to have debated. This ensures the students and teams are writing legislation throughout the entire year, and if they write their own bill, presumably they know the ins and outs of it, which gives them a little bit of an advantage. You're not going to be able to debate 10 pieces of legislation when we normally debate 4. The students will then set the agenda, and this becomes critically important. If they have over-prepared for bill number 6, they're going to want to make sure bill number 6 is in the top half of the order so that they have a chance to get to it. That's going to cause some more student collaboration, more thought into the agenda setting. So the central question of this presentation, the reason I'm giving this presentation, is I'm trying to ask the question, by doing the IHSFA season or month-long docket, are we actually holding back congressional debate because the kids are playing the game that is going to win based upon the rules that we give them? Meaning that if we change the rules, will we get the input that we've always desired? Here's my belief. This is definitely something you can argue with. I believe that our current system of a preseason or season-long docket is that it rewards the creation of canned, pre-prepared, scripted speeches. This results in our students writing less speeches as they reuse the same ones for each tournament. It also results in them researching less and being less spontaneous and round, such as tabling a bill, pushing an amendment, or responding and refuting to their opponents. If, however, we ditch the docket and instead allow them to choose topics that they are invested in, that they want to debate, that are current and interesting to them, we will encourage more about what makes congressional debate academically special. We will change the event for the better. So let's return back to this list of what we love about Congress. The idea it's applicable, there's minimal entry barriers, it's student controlled, there's collaboration, and they debate a lot of timely topics. Our Indiana system rewards canned speeches, in my opinion, over extemporaneous presentations. Extemporaneous presentations are amazing with eye contact and hand gestures. However, their word choice, their vocabulary, their likelihood of stuttering or hesitating like I just did is going to be higher than if you have a pre-written canned speech. And if you've practiced that pre-written canned speech enough, you can fake the eye contact and the hand gestures well enough that you're going to sound really eloquent, professional, and perfect. This doesn't mean that everybody who wins are people who can speeches. I would argue that the top 2 or 3 Congress people in the state each year are the people who are really, really good extemporaneous speakers. Okay. The question is, how do we get that middle to that point, or the bottom up to doing some things like that? I believe that if you ditch the docket and every tournament has more legislation than necessary, it's going to reward research and adaptability. If I have 10 to 15 bills in 1 week, there's no way I'm writing 15 to 30 speeches. It's not happening. There's also no way I'm going to be able to research every topic and brief everything. However, what I am going to do is, like discussion, I'm going to read about each of these topics. I'm going to educate myself about each of these topics. And instead of putting together speeches, I'm going to put together ideas. I'm then going to need to construct those ideas, and I'm only going to construct them if we're debating that topic. For minimal entry barriers, it is true that Indiana is very, very minimal. All you have to do is write 1 3-minute speech, and then you can just sit there. You don't even have to ask cross-ex questions if you don't want. Now, the second bullet on ditching the docket is there's still a place for those kids. If you want to keep those kids on your team and hope that they mature and grow into a debater who's willing to speak, we have supporters on World School as your 4th and 5th speaker who might be able to contribute to the team, but are unwilling to speak. If you ditch the docket, you do increase the entry by forcing them to learn about more topics. But I would argue that that's a good thing because that's the educational component. They're learning about more things than just the 4 pieces of legislation. They're learning about 6, 7, 8, 10 different things. Okay. I also think forcing the entry barrier is good because Congress can get a bad rap by those kids who are doing no work and just sitting there. And that then causes attitude change, negative connotations around your Congress team. Our experience at Chesterton is our policy LD and public forum will kind of nag and tease our Congress group a little bit just because they view what they're doing as harder. Be aware that all of your kids are capable of doing what I'm saying. We used to an extent have the option of a note card. Okay, so in 30 minutes, our extempers could find out about a topic, go to newspaper files. They then could write a speech and write 50 words on a note card and then go deliver a 7-minute speech. All we're asking Congress kids to do is research topics. They can write a full outline, not on a note card, not limited by number, but they can put it on a legal pad, they can put it on a notepad, and they can use that up there speaking just like extempers used to on note cards. I would argue that that's still while it's a higher minimum, I still think it's a reasonable minimum for what we should expect our kids to do. I think they're capable of it. Student controlled is where Indiana's really bad, and ditching the docket would be really good. In Indiana, there is minimal student control. You debate what you're told, and because you only have 4 bills, you can't really table anything. You'll end too early, and your coaches will get mad at you, and you're just stuck there at a cafeteria. You can imagine virtually kids ending debate extremely fast so they can go play video games at home. That's a worry that I've got if we don't give them enough stuff to debate, is that the Congress kids are going to do what regular season discussions do and have about 1/3 of the time, which is bad for our NSDA points. It's bad for our kids' engagement. It's bad for them wanting to pay or go to another tournament. If you ditch the docket, students have a lot of control over which ones they prioritize. Instead of automatically spending an hour on each bill, they could do a quick debate on one so that they can get to more things. Not everybody has to speak on the second one because we're going to try to get to the 6th, 7th, or 8th one. There becomes more strategy elements in there. Now that will have to change how we do our judges. If you're judging each one on just one round and then you're switching judges like some tournaments do, obviously they're going to want to give a speech on every single bill. However, if you've got judges that stick around for multiple time periods, multiple bills, they can easily lay something on the table and then decide to come back to it later on to kind of impress the judges, pick it up again. In the end, it creates more student control, particularly when they're writing legislation. They're picking the topics that they want to debate. It also increases collaboration or coalitions. In Indiana, there are loose alliances that happen. Sometimes it's with help with questions like, hey, throw me a softball here. For the most part, however, alliances and coalitions, I don't know that I see them. Ditching the docket, they do have to work together to talk about which bills to prioritize. You can imagine 1 week, Chesterton, Valpo, and Ben Davis all deciding, hey, we really like this. Let's vote together here to get this in so that we can debate it. Those types of coalition forming is one of the unique elements of Student Congress that I don't necessarily think we're getting. Lastly, debating a lot of topics. Honestly, the docket gets really old fast. When we talk about 14 bills, there's always 2 or 3 of them that never really get picked. And there's always 2 or 3 that always get picked. And my kids at least get sick of them. It's nice to be able to not have to write speeches during that week because they already have them and they have the research, but that just means our Congress kids sit around not doing much that week. Some of the topics are already pretty old and less relevant, and there's newer stuff that have happened that take out a couple of bills. If we have new legislation constantly being written and it's being submitted and written by our students, not only do they learn how to write better legislation for our state and district series, it also means that they're picking topics that matter to them. If we give them 10 pieces of legislation, even if it's coach written, they will have to prioritize it in a way that says, hey, I want to debate this, I like debating this, and we'll be able to learn kind of what they want. I always look back at very early on, Public Forum did a topic about rescinding the NBA dress code. That's the type of thing no coach would ever write a bill on, and I wouldn't suggest it for Congress either. But that was a topic we talked about forever that was really interesting. And so when we talk about a better range of seriousness, not every single bill needs to be like a major, huge issue. There are some things that we can do in Congress that might be less on the serious end, which gives us more of a range. If you look at the bills we have for the first month, they are all super serious, and a lot of them don't have a ton of relevance to our students, particularly like the Russia and Crimea aspect. Good to learn about, but if everybody does those same bills for the first month, our kids don't want to debate Russia and Crimea for 5 straight weeks. I would argue at least most of them don't. So here's my recommendation. Remember, you are in control of your own tournament. The board sets the IHSFA state tournament and what happens there. Your own individual tournament, you're allowed to do what you want. And Congress has been really good about this, where different tournaments will have generally different tweaks to the congressional aspect. I would say we should adopt a best practice model and offer more legislation than can be debated during your tournament. I think it's awesome to have a mix of the IHSFA docket of the 5 that they give you each month. Maybe you pick 1 or 2 of them. And then you include new legislation, either written by the host team or requested from participating teams. That's what most states are doing, and that's kind of the best practices model. If the kids want to debate the IHSFA stuff each week, they will put that at the beginning, and we'll actually be able to see what they want to do. The new legislation, they'll be able to sort through and kind of figure out what they want to debate a little bit more. So I'm not going to stay on here long, and we're going to have about 20 minutes where we can kind of discuss or ask questions. These are what I believe are the pros if we get rid of the docket and we give kids more legislation rather than less. Students are going to get more control, which bills are debated, how long, instead of an automatic hour. If a bill is one-sided and they find out it's one-sided, we're not going to just sit there and break these rules. If there's 3 speeches in a row on the app, that bill should be done, and we move on to the next, and we've got extra legislation to where kids will debate a longer amount of time than just getting an extra lunch. They'll write the legislation, which creates new research aspect to their educational experience, where they have to think on both sides instead of just researching one side. And you can grant sponsorship at more tournaments than just district, which allows for some strategic thought and flexibility if you are the one who actually wrote the legislation. In this scenario, the topics will be ever changing. So there's probably less practice on canned speeches, more practice on what are the arguments, how do I just talk, how do I do real world speaking. That means they're going to spend more time researching argument collection than speech practicing or speech writing. It should, I think, draw more kids to the event and keep them there. I sometimes have a hard time with my top novices of keeping them in Congress. The reason why is they don't get to speak enough. In 1 hour, they're going to give a 3-minute speech. And if they ask 5 questions, that's another 2 minutes or so. So in an hour, they are only speaking for about 5 to 6 minutes. Compare that to a Lincoln Douglas debater who's speaking 24 minutes in 45 minutes. Public forum who's speaking 12 to 15 minutes in 45 minutes. And a policy debater who is speaking an hour and a half divided by 4 during that time. All of them have a higher percentage proportionately of speaking in a round that Congress kids, even if they're asking questions, can get bored. And so they get drawn to the other events because of that. I think this keeps it more fresh and gives them more stuff to do, even though they're not speaking as much. There's more strategy. I think team building, having your own team work together, but also the ability to coalition build becomes more important. I think it forces our kids to talk to the other kids and to strategize on a week-by-week basis, which I think is interesting, even though that coalition forming will sometimes go for your team and sometimes against your team. With less practice-prepared speeches, I would think those debating should rise. It's going to be really hard to can the number of speeches that I'm suggesting and practice them to a level. Like, essentially, I'm making it beyond difficult to do that. If everybody's doing more extemporaneous speaking, those doing that and the argument building should be able to rise up a little bit more. And students will be more prepared if they travel to non-Indiana tournaments. I know the first time my kids ever make nationals, when they see the national docket, they are just stunned, because their plan is to write out a speech for AF and a speech for NEG for every single bill. And then when you have 25 bills and you only debate 7 of them and you have pre-written all of these other speeches, it's disheartening to say the least. And those canned speeches don't work as well at nationals. It's people who can speak with good eye contact, hand gestures, off the cuff professionally. I think we need to prepare kids for that. So at this point in time, I kind of want to turn it over to discussion. We've got about 25 minutes here. Remember, this is not necessarily what the board or IHSFA or anybody is telling you to do. These are my thoughts, my ideas of what goes on in the rest of the state, and this idea that maybe we are actually setting up the parts we hate about Congress to happen, that kids are playing by the rules that we set up. At this point, we're going to turn it over to all of you guys. So I see there's been some aspect on the chat. We can continue to talk about that. But thoughts?
Well, Chris, you know I've been a proponent of having, like, trying to get rid of the everybody has to speak on every single bill in the past. I think I like the idea of it. I've always liked the idea. A lot of it will, in my opinion, depend on judge training and student training as well. You know, that idea of, like, the kids needing to realize you don't have to speak on every single bill that, you know, you have in the session. That 2 good speeches, that kind of thing.
I think one of the detriments is when a tournament switches judges every round. In that scenario, so West Lafayette likes to do that at their tournament. They typically do 5 bills, and they're a set hour in order, and the judge switches every time. That allows you to get 5 different critiques from 5 different judges, which is a really good idea. However, if I choose to not speak on bill number 3, because precedence of recency doesn't reset, like, it keeps going, but the judge switches. If I choose to not give a speech on bill 3, to be able to give 2 speeches on bill 4, well, that judge that saw me only for the round I didn't do anything, I'm going to be low on them, and that's going to kill me based upon the golf scoring. And so sometimes, if you want a place, it's literally a requirement that you speak on everyone. Other thoughts, ideas? Like it, love it, hate it? Think your kids will hate it? Some of the kids do Congress because they do like the fact that they can just give the same speech over and over again. I don't
I
necessarily think that's what we should encourage, though.
absolutely not. I like it. Honestly, I mean, I was intrigued from the beginning, and then the more I heard about it, the more I noticed like student relevance and student autonomy are like at the top of the list for how to get kids engaged. So, I mean, I don't think there's any argument that kids would feel like things are more relevant if they knew that they were going to be debating bills that they just wrote. I know my Congress squad likes to collaborate on their research, but when they only have to research 15 bills for like the whole season, they get done with that pretty quickly. And it's like pulling teeth to get them to do anything else in practice. So having to collaborate as a team, even in practice, not to mention the opportunity to collaborate with other teams when you're actually there and form these coalitions, just the idea that it would force them to collaborate and to do research and then come share it with each other and figure out, okay, how are we approaching this? What are different people's opinions? Because there's too much for one person to do all of it. As a coach, I really like that idea. As a judge, as a parliamentarian, I love it. I think it's a great direction to look into. I don't know that it's 100% perfect. And I do like Matt's suggestion of like weaning them off of the canned speeches and into more of this forcing them to be extemporaneous, but I definitely see potential in it.
I was looking at the chat. Let me talk about Jeff. So Jeff, as an at-large member, was at the board that kind of made this decision to go to 5, and I wasn't there. So, like, correct anything I say. It's definitely a pro, as he wrote in, that every month we're going to get some new topics. They are going to have to decide: are they writing those? Are they borrowing them from other tournaments? Are they taking them from nationals? Are they student submitted or school submitted? I don't know that they have a decision on that yet. Here's my scare and worry about the change that happened. My worry is October, there's usually 4 tournaments typically. If they give us 4 of those 5 bills for each of the same weeks, here's the pro. So if I go to Chesterton, then to Munster, then to Valpo, then to Ben Davis's tournament, and they all pick from those 5 bills and give us 4 each, at the first tournament at Chesterton, I can hear Abby's kid's speech, and maybe I consider her a rival. I could next week, assuming that she's going to be there, I could pre-plan, prepare, pre-script an attack against her speech, assuming that she'll give it again. That actually gets into some of the stuff policy debaters do, where they hear a case and then they prep out the whole thing and they cross their fingers, don't change it, I want to destroy it, which would be really cool. I think kids will just give the same speech over and over again. And I also don't know that we want them to like script that attack speech. I think we want to get them to a point where they can do that on the fly the same way a policy debater could. Policy debaters will hear a brand new case. They get 3 minutes, basically a free prep time, and then they will give, sometimes eloquently, an 8-minute speech on it. That's what our high schoolers are able to do. So I don't know that they need the whole week between to attack a speech. But I do think the IHSFA docket does change the game quite a bit to people who go every week. I can prepare an attack speech against somebody who doesn't change their speech each week. And I think that will be interesting to see if that happens.
Because I know, Chris, there were some of us who were really interested in your proposal. And so the change was kind of a compromise of there are still going to be coaches and, you know, judges, et cetera, who are like, whoa, we want that structure. So we figured this way it'd be a way of easing in. As far as where they were going to get the bills, the Congress committee, we discussed some of that. So I don't know what their plan is as far as where they'll get them.
Thoughts, ideas, questions? Dylan, I'd agree with you on my team. Our Congress debaters are fiercely loyal to Congress and really like it, the ones that stay with it. It's very easy to make an offhand comment that devalues them. I know one of the times Jim Cavallo, my old coach, got really mad at me when I was coaching was he heard me make a joke to my public forum team about Congress. And the joke had a little bit of truth in the work level they were doing, but he was going to defend his kids and they were going to defend them. I think one of the comments that has some truth to it that can be offensive is that Congress is more like a speech event. Okay. And I think there's great examples. I think the top kids of state this year are pretty good examples of not being full-blown speech kids and really good Congress kids. But I also think like Munster's top two kids, for instance, honed their craft and extemp. They were two of the best extempers in the state as well. And so I think a marriage between your extemp team and your Congress team is the best way to produce the best Congress debaters. Like, I think if they do full-time Congress, they're at a disadvantage. I think if they never do Congress and just try to come in for the weekend, we've seen the elite get away with that. But I think a marriage between the two is the best way to produce people. Yeah, so Jessica's seen that at Munster. And like Jessica's team, like you've had some dominant Congress people who are full-time for the last couple of years. And so the fact that it's happening over there, even when their kids are at the top of the game, that shows it's probably happening everywhere. Anybody totally brand new to Congress, like have never coached it before, never seen it before, want to chime in or add if this makes it you think easier or harder? Again, if you do like this proposal, I 100% encourage you to, in your tournament invitation, think about what you want to do in advance with Congress. I think Congress is an interesting opportunity because no other event is student controlled in this way, where they have the ability to decide what's debated, how it's debated, those types of things. And so I think if last 3 or 4 years, I've really been on student empowerment bandwagon, and doing more and more and more and trusting the kids and kind of giving them opportunity while still knowing they're high schoolers and putting up guardrails and those types of things. I will say for our tournament, we're definitely going to release more, especially with it virtual. I don't know that we'll continue the unique round that we've done, although I really, really like it. But I think there needs to be like in-person collaboration between competitors and schools in the same room for that to work really well. But we'll definitely release more. I'm still not positive on the number. I'm thinking if we normally have time to debate 4 or 5 bills, I'm thinking 10. I hate it. I've gone to Missouri tournaments where they gave us 15 bills and they debated 2 of them. I think that's stupid. You don't want kids to feel like they totally wasted their research. But if you do some quick debate, you lay things on the table, you do some parliamentary procedure there, I don't see why kids couldn't get to 6 or 7 bills, which means if you're working on all of them, you're not wasting that much research, and you can always resubmit or rewrite a bill and submit it for another tournament and see if you can get it in there. Do some coalition building where you can secure some votes beforehand, talk to your teammates about why didn't you do that or your opponents. I think there's more collaboration that can happen. The coalition building fascinates me. As a large school, I can see it helping if I can get all of my kids to vote together. I can also see as a known program, all of the other schools getting together and saying like, let's form a coalition here where we are controlling it. And then that weekend, like, I think that politics that can happen in coalition building, both the good and the bad, would be really, really unique, and a unique element. Nationals, we're always frustrated because there's a national circuit like chat that happens that kind of predetermines what bills get debated or not. And so there are some people who are kind of preparing the agenda ahead of time because they've done coalition building, because they travel to all these tournaments together.
Chris, that's kind of what I brought up in the chat, is that for the more experienced Congress students, certainly this makes it more challenging, more exciting, and it's definitely more of a clashing style debate, right? Because you're gonna have 10 resolutions or 10 bills, and they have to prepare for more, and some of them aren't going to come up, and some of them are. I think the downside is that for novice kids, and I'm a third party, like I'm usually just a judge in this event, because we had 2 Congress kids on our team and they both graduated. So I don't even know if we have a Congress team this year. I'm going to have to recruit a lot of freshmen. But knowing that coming in, part of the problem is that, those freshmen, they're going to be preparing for, under the old system, 4 or 5 bills. If those bills don't get heard or recognized, they're going to come away from the tournament just having only been to 1 or 2 tournaments, like, why did I do this work? Why did I put this in? It's the same kind of issue with, when I was judging a couple rounds last year, and there were 4 or 5 bills, and the kids wanted to truncate the discussion after like 3 bills, or no, after the first or second bill, because the kids that had planned for it and prepared for it had given their speeches. So they called the question. And when they called the question, the other kids that had prepared the speeches didn't get a chance to give their speeches. But those are the rules, because 2/3 of the room or whatever called the question, right? Well, I was perfectly okay with that. Seems like that should happen. That's strategy, baby. I mean, that seems to me like it should be strategy. But I totally get, how a young debater in the room who's in Congress for the first time on the flip side could be like, wait, I just prepared for this, and now, because I don't know how parliamentary procedure works, I don't get to give my speech. Or if I'm not in the particular chat room before the speech starts, before Congress starts, because I'm not networked with all these schools, I'm at a disadvantage. So I think my point on the thread, and again, I have no dog in this fight because I don't even know if I have a team this year, but my concern would be if I had a bunch of newbies coming in, would they, or if we had a lot of experienced debaters in the cafeteria or the hallways or something, would they preset what bills they were going to call, like coming into the room? And then they would know, they would have a little bit of an advantage because they wouldn't have to prepare for all 10, really, Just a few thoughts there.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a couple of things here. First, the coalition building would be interesting to see. I think there would definitely be some downsides. Okay, and there would be some shutout aspects to it. You also know that getting your own team on the same page is sometimes impossible, like that type of stuff. And so you might see, like I've got Adam Royster, his favorite thing to do in Congress is to attack his teammates. I can't get him to stop it. That's what he likes to do. And so he might join a coalition of other schools against. There are definitely pros and cons to that. I think we would have to coach our kids to start learning to politic, at least once you're in the room, once you're in the chamber, those types of things. And that randomized chamber still leads elements to it. I watch Big Brother. Right now, there's a big alliance in there, and then there's about 10 people who aren't in that alliance, and they are just like, okay, I'm just not in it, and they're going to get picked off one after one.
What do you think about that issue of calling the question before everybody gives their speeches? Because when I saw it happen, it's actually happened 2 or 3 times. The parliamentarian or the judge, not the kid, the judge told them they couldn't do that.
Yeah, so
whoever was in the room, and that leaves not as much element of student choice, which is what we're trying to get at.
Yeah, I have the exact same thought as you. I think it's total strategy and planning and team and gamesmanship, and I'm a policy debate guy, so like I love that stuff. However, the NSDA is actually very clear on it. They say that due to the educational prioritization of it, everybody that wants to speak should be given the opportunity to speak. Now, there's a conflicting rule. There's a specific rule in parliamentary procedure that if you get 3 bills on the same side in a row, that ends debate. I've seen some Indiana tournaments, especially in novice, who have scrapped that rule in order to make sure everybody speaks because you only have the 4 bills to get to.
You mean like three on the affirmative speeches in a row, and then you would call it? Yeah.
Yes, that's supposed to be automatic at that point in time. I think if you have multiple bills, people would follow that rule. And well, look, you weren't prepared on both sides, so we have to move on. You're going to get another opportunity in another place. But the NSDA, Adam Jacoby speaks on this quite a bit. They specifically discourage kids from strategizing to call the question to exclude an opponent out. So
I always thought it seemed like more challenging though, because if one kid called the question, or if you're in the room and you prepared for a pro, and then you see that everybody has pros, so you might have the question called. If you had prepared for a con also, if you prepared for both sides, you could just easily switch over and then you would never have to worry.
Correct. And that's actually the point of that rule, is to try to force that instead of everybody canning and coming in with it. I also wonder, based on what you said, and then I'll go to Jeff. The third thing I wanted to say based upon what you said, I wonder if you try the ditch the docket aspect and you give like 10, you could give 10 to the varsity, and then you could give 7 of those 10 to the novices. Maybe there's a little bit more preparation or help. You're still having collaboration between your varsity and novice on most of them, but maybe not all of them. So maybe that's a slight compromise element. Jeff?
I'm going to offer a slight counterpoint to Chris's comments as far as the early calling of the question. So from a coach standpoint, it's really frustrating to me when I take my kids to a tournament, and and it happened 2 or 3 times last year, where they come out of a round 45 minutes early, and I'm like, what's the deal? And they're like, well, they called the question early, and we didn't have enough people to vote against it, and it happened to be a smaller tournament, and because there were 1 or 2 teams who had large contingents of Congress kids, as I mentioned in the chat, there, once the bigwigs of the one team got all their speeches in, they were like, well, we're calling the question now. So and the students didn't have that opportunity to caucus and politic before they realized what had happened to them. And so I don't have a problem calling the question, I guess, early before every single person speaks, as long as, number one, we have other speeches on the docket that those students then have the opportunity to get in and compete against other students. And if it's not a reason to well, let's be done, 40 minutes early so we can go hang out in the cafeteria and play our spoons or whatever else that, Congress kids are playing these days. So that's where I get, as a parliamentarian, I have been known to say I overrule that if I feel as though it's done because of, if we have plenty of time, what's the purpose of that?
See, and some of that could happen in this proposal, like that shenanigans, that team aspect can. Do you think more bills would help prevent that, or do you think it would make people move to question quicker?
I think if we had so for example, I'll take me as an example. Let's say I'm not sure I'll do this yet, but let's say in my October 10th tournament, I put 5 or 6 bills for the morning and say, you have 2.5 hours to debate these 5 or 6 bills, with instructions to the judges to say, it's not, what do I want to say? You don't have to don't judge them based on how many speeches they give, all those kind of information, blah, blah, blah. And then that way, if they want to zip through, if my students I would tell them, you need to be prepared to talk on all 6, but understand you may not have to or want to or need to, because you're being judged through that whole 2.5 hour slot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, then if you had a minimum, you have to debate, NSDA district requirements are they have to debate a certain amount of time.
Yeah. I think there's a different level of disappointment if you have a pre-written, pre-practiced 3-minute speech that you don't get to give. Then I had 3 or 4 good arguments that I wanted to talk about. Like, I feel like if kids are doing that model where they're not pre-writing, there'll be a couple of kids that still try to pre-write for all 10 bills, even though coaches tell them not to. I think there's a different level of disappointment than I didn't get to give this argument. I didn't do that. Instead of, I practiced this speech all week. It could still be disappointing, but I think it's a different level. I think Congress is an event that is due to be played with. We definitely should be thinking in our tournament model, what do we want the kids to get out of Congress? And you should try to play with the idea of how you set up your Congress tournament and the rules that you set up your Congress tournament. For instance, there's nothing wrong with what Jeff just said about districts, although at districts 6 hours is a lot. But saying, look, before they adjourn, there must be a minimum of 4 hours or however long you've decided is the right amount for your tournament. That could force them to give new second speeches. It could force them to up their cross-X time. But changing that input can have an effect on how the kids debate because they have to adapt to the rule set that we put in. And so I think for a long time as coaches, we've been like, well, let's just train the judges to like debate. Let's put like a Yakey in Congress every single time and he'll steer it. But I think there's more levers that we can push to try to get Congress to where we want it if we put those thoughts in. Okay, so I encourage you, play around with it. Play around with the new IHSFA docket. Be aware at your own tournament, you can use those bills. You can use more than those bills. You can have people submit bills. So I'd encourage you to play around. All right, if you haven't had it, have a wonderful lunch. Enjoy the rest of your sessions.